Hello, everybody. Welcome again to the course. Today's class is on the deeper planetary functions of each planet and what I'm calling in this moment the trauma bonds. So, this class essentially, we're going to go through each of the planets in a way that goes beyond the archetypical signatures, beyond the classic psychological functions that we have related to each planet. And I'm going to take us on a much deeper journey through the depth of how we can gain more understanding about an individual's trauma via the birth chart. So, we understand that we are infinite beings, that our souls can never be destroyed, and that we essentially on this soul level go far beyond the ego constructs. However, we are utilizing our egos, also our bodies, to have this realized experience of our soul as a human, right? So this here that I'm presenting goes very deep into the evolutionary astrology philosophies as taught by Jeffrey Wolf Green, by Stephen Forrest. I have also learned much deeper, particularly around the trauma complex that we can identify in each planet through one of my teachers, Michael DeBaker, who he really took Jeffrey Wolf Green's work and expanded on it tremendously. So he's out there, he's written quite a few books, and it's all quite complex what he's teaching. So definitely a fundamental understanding of astrology and evolutionary astrology is necessary to dive in with his work. So here, let's begin. This idea of multiple self, and of course, I'm not referring to the state of multiple personalities. That's something completely different. This is about the reality of our consciousness storing memories of other lifetimes, essentially other selves. And it's a really interesting topic to ponder because we can relate and understand and feel that we are currently dealing with patterns of the ancestors, patterns of another time, patterns and habits, and essentially trauma from another time, from another self, from another being, right? So this is what this idea of multiple self goes into. And it has been studied deeply and just throughout time from philosophers, etc. So the multidimensional psyche is a term coined, that specific term, by regression therapists. Roger Wolger, he's written many books, amazing in that field. It is the self known as me in this life, who carries timelines, wounding, and personalities which have come through from other lifetimes, each with their own fears, anxieties, propensities, psychological dispositions, gifts, and skills. There is a need to reenact certain parts of their story in an attempt to bring them to closure. So this idea that we repeat, essentially the reason why we reenact and we keep patterns and habits going is essentially because we haven't learned the lesson. We haven't learned the core lesson. We haven't gained our own sense of true self from out of potentially the fracturing of self that occurred during that event, during that trauma. Because as souls operating with an ego function, we do take on quite a bit of interference, we can call it. We take on certain genetic programs, certain belief systems, we inherit. And we inherit from the masses, we inherit from the collective, we inherit from our own families. And we just sort of innocently take on constructs, mental constructs, psychological constructs, emotional constructs. And it essentially becomes us, but it's not essentially us. It's not the true self. So this idea that we are beyond the ego, of course, but we can get further and further away from our own true essence, from our own infinite self, from our own higher self. So we all know this. This is this process that we're going through. And so this is what we're identifying when we're looking at the chart, the potentials around where has the soul been corrupted in a sense, because not necessarily the soul itself being corrupted, but that the ego structure has been corrupted in such a way that it becomes this overlay, this powerful overlay over the soul, because we are feeding it. Not only do we continuously feed these potential interferences, these patterns, these habits, but the collective itself feeds them. So there's quite a force of energy going on around keeping the ego and these sort of false programs that keep us limited from the fact that we are infinite beings, which means that we have the capacity to tap into infinite potential, that miracles can happen, that the unimaginable can happen, that we can all live in an experience of infinite potential, essentially, if we believe, or if we remember that that truly is our birthright, that is our reality as infinite beings. But what we see going on the planet, which has been strengthened for thousands and thousands of years, is this strengthening of the ego constructs, that essentially this whole sort of matrix 3D realm, when we know that there's more beyond the 3D realm. There is more beyond the matter, that everything is energy. And so Carl Jung proposed that complexes are clusters of feelings, memories, and thoughts around specific emotional themes, often operating outside of our conscious awareness. So this is a very strong idea, the ego complexes, these emotional complexes, the complexes of thought. So Roger Wilger expanded on Jung's complex theory, explaining how karmic complexes are like a psychic scar tissue, which has us repeat the same patterns over and over again from one lifetime to the next. So this very real experience of the etheric body carries the imprints from other lifetimes, that there is a genetic inheritance, that we carry these patterns, these complexes through generations, and we live through them. We essentially repeat them, and they're largely unconscious. So our job essentially as spiritual beings is to become more and more clear, more and more aware of the this dynamic experience that we're having, that there is this power of the ego and there is this power of the soul. And the more we live from that soul orientation, from that higher self orientation, from that orientation that we are infinite beings, that we have the capacity to tap into infinite realms, infinitely creative space, that we will live in a much different way. But on the contrary, when we feed into the programs of the limited self, that the program of suffering and all of the other ego constructs, that we will also strengthen that. And so that this is the journey and part of the work. And so we can really identify these things in the birth chart. So a traumatic experience will weave together components of all aspects of our subtle bodies, including the mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual, creating a karmic complex or a trauma complex. Woundedness, we find, needs to be embraced in order for it to be healed. So essentially what that means needs to be embraced is we need to give awareness. We essentially need to become aware of the issues, of the patterns, of the interference to our true self that is occurring. And so when we become aware, when we give awareness, when we center in awareness, when we embrace rather than avoid or be unaware of it, that's when we really begin to heal. That's when we begin to come back into our true essential nature. So we also need to assume responsibility for our own healing. We do need to do the work. We need to be devoted, and excuse me, we need to put our effort and our intention. We always are putting effort and intention in some direction, whether we're conscious or intentional about it or not, right? So if we are feeding the ego structures, feeding the, what I mean is the negative sort of programs, the negative belief systems that we're not enough, that we can't have certain things, that we're not ready yet, that we're not worthy, that it's not going to work for us, like all of these ideas that essentially lower our vibration and lower our essential connection to our truth. Because as true, when we are in the truth of our infinite nature, none of these things are true. We are not limited. We're not ready. We're not good enough. We're not undeserving. We're none of those things in our true spirit. So by assuming responsibility for our own healing, we have to reorient in this way. So trauma is stored in our cellular memory. We do have a memory. It doesn't essentially ever go away until it is embraced with awareness. And trauma is held in the etheric body and leaves an imprint onto physical matter. So we carry forth dispositions, physical, emotional, spiritual, and psychological. The soul reenacts it to heal and further its own evolution. So essentially, this is talking about that how we evolve is through the embracing of the patterns through awareness. We embrace the patterns through becoming aware of the patterns, of the habits, of the negative thoughts, of the negative belief systems about our own nature that are false and untrue. And then we work to essentially reinstate the true belief system, which is that we are more than worthy, that we are infinite beings. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to walk us through the actual planetary functions and how they relate to trauma. And then I'll bring up a chart and we'll have a little bit more example. And so I've already spoken about this a few times, and this is something that does take quite a bit of practice to really grasp and to be able to put it into practice while interpreting birth charts. So it comes over time, and we'll spend a lot more time in the school when we're going over chart interpretations, and we'll go through the practice of how to really work with this method. So through Chiron, trauma streams into the current life as pain, and with it, the potential for overcoming the trauma and healing the pain. So we know that Chiron is the wounded healer, and Chiron represents the current pain body issue that the person is here to resolve. So when we look at where Chiron is in a birth chart and house and sign and whatever it's an aspect to, we can gain a deeper understanding of what the particular trauma complex that person has come here to essentially embrace, to become aware of, and to resolve, to evolve by essentially resolving the false belief system around it. So Chiron is the trauma key. We can see that Chiron is shaped like a key. It's really interesting like that. Chiron carries the subtle trauma body collected from Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto and delivers it to Saturn, giving it form. So this goes much deeper into the methodology with this. I've spoken about it before, how Chiron moves in between Saturn and Uranus. So Saturn, then comes Uranus. Saturn is this boundary. It's the furthest planet out that we can see with our naked eye. It represents the structure of our actual consciousness, the perimeter, the barrier. And Uranus represents this higher mind. It's the storehouse of unconscious individual memory. So it's the individualized consciousness. So everything that a person has ever experienced throughout lifetimes is going to be in a memory bank. And that is the symbolism of Uranus. It's there. It's in the unconscious aspect of ourself that is our individualized unconscious. And so, and then there's Uranus, and then beyond Uranus is Neptune and Pluto. And so Neptune represents an emotional, symbolically, it's going to represent an aspect of emotional trauma. And Pluto is going to represent an aspect of psychological emotional trauma. And so Pluto's trauma and Neptune's trauma and Uranus, the mental aspect of trauma, is all going to be contained in this sort of library storehouse that Uranus has. And as Chiron moves, going out all the way to Uranus and then returning back to Saturn, this is representing how Chiron goes out to the library, let's say, that Uranus contains of this individualized unconscious aspect of an individual, taps into that trauma package, we can call it, and then comes and delivers it to Saturn. Basically, we receive. Saturn is the receiver of what that pain body trauma complex is. And so when we're looking at the symbol of Saturn in a birth chart, we can see how it represents the person's, what they're dealing with, that is an incredible challenge on this level of trauma, which we can identify in Chiron. and then we can further identify in Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. So Saturn is going to represent, when we look at the symbol of Saturn, we see what house it's in, what sign it's in, what aspects it's making. And then we can see, oh yeah, I can see how the physical form and structure of this person is created in such a way that it is focused upon what that trauma is. That is their struggle, that is their challenge, that is something that they seriously have to overcome, which is what Saturn is going to represent. But it's also, Saturn represents, you want to look at it as it represents an aspect that the soul created to assist its growth, to assist its evolution into its highest expression of self. So Saturn is going to, on the one hand, take us back to that Chiron trauma. And on the other hand, it's going to represent being basically like an assistant to the Pluto polarity point. If the Pluto polarity point, as we know it, represents a high path for growth and evolution for that person, sort of a way up or a way out into a greater expression of true self, the Pluto polarity point, Saturn is assisting that. So we'll go deeper into example. So as I've written here, Saturn is the form in physical body, and it is the structure of our consciousness, giving it form. So Saturn by house and sign is partly determined by Chiron and partly determined by Pluto polarity point. Saturn in evolutionary astrology is the way the soul wants consciousness to operate in its vehicle. So it's so divine, it's so magnificent when we look at the Saturn. We can see that Saturn, as being delivered the trauma package message from Chiron, that Saturn does hold very powerfully what is a deep struggle in that person to overcome. And yet, though, it's always going to contain what is essentially here to be healed. You know, Chiron does represent the potential to overcome the trauma and heal that very issue. And so Saturn likewise represents that this is the very challenge and struggle that is so incredible in the person that they are here to overcome and to rise above. And so that aspect of when they do rise above and when they actualize the high potential, the divine soul potential of that archetype that we find in their Saturn, whatever sign and house and aspects it's making, when they do, they will essentially be on their highest path of growth, assisting the Pluto polarity point. So Saturn evolutionary astrology is the way the soul wants consciousness to operate in its vehicle. How it wants consciousness structured. It's formed by Chiron, the trauma charge, and Pluto polarity point, where it seeks to evolve towards. Okay, so now I'm going to explain a little bit more about the other planets. So essentially what we have here is when we're talking about trauma, the trauma complex, the trauma, essentially how when we go through trauma, that it does get stored in our etheric body. And anytime we go through any kind of trauma, it is going to affect the whole being. It's going to affect us on a mental level, on an emotional level, on a psychological level, on a spiritual level. So we can see here the mental component of the trauma is represented by Uranus. The emotional component, the deep emotional psychological component, is represented by Pluto. The physical component is represented by Saturn and Uranus. And the emotional, meaningless component, existential futility, is represented by Neptune. So Uranus is the library of memories in the individuated unconscious. It's subconscious data storage. So Uranus is the storehouse of data. Remember that Uranus is the higher octave of Mercury. So Mercury is all about linear logical facts. Uranus is that. It just is. It's all that just is on that factual linear level. Essentially, what's different, a higher octave is always going to represent a higher vibrational frequency. So Mars is the lower octave of Pluto being the higher octave. Venus is the lower octave of Neptune being the higher octave. So it's vibrating at a higher frequency. And so Uranus is the storehouse of data on that factual level. But how they differ is that Mercury is linear. It's following the code of how things are and unfold. But where Uranus is, it is this nonlinear storage base. Essentially, what that means is we can be affected from, like, time and space is completely different. Right? It's time and space where we can be being affected by things that happen in other lifetimes, thousands of years ago. So this is the difference between the Uranus and Mercury. So Uranus, we know it's non-emotional. Uranus shows us where we can heal the trauma by going into the trauma and raising the vibration of the archetype. It's all about liberation. So where we see Uranus in a birth chart by house and sign and aspects that it's making, it does represent an aspect of deep trauma in the body, in the mind, a fracturing where the person experienced deep trauma. And it also is representing how they can raise that very vibration of that archetype into their own liberation. Okay. So Chiron relays the memories from Uranus to Saturn. Neptune carries a sense of meaninglessness, disillusionment, disenchantment, and despair as a direct result of the traumatic event. So Neptune is very profound in this way that when we look to Neptune in a birth chart, we understand that it is that high spiritual component, the multi-dimensional component of our existence, the infinite realms, the infinite creative potential, the source energy, the God energy. So there's so many different ways that this can be understood and connected to on the spectrum. So we look at Neptune and we can see where there is that infinite nature, where there's deep mystery, the unfathomable, the naivety, the innocence in somebody. So when we looked Neptune in a house and sign, that can be where the person is naive, is innocent, has more of a surrendered approach. And then also, on the other hand, it can be the path of spiritualization where they are going to need to surrender into a greater power, surrender into their higher self to experience that archetype. And so when we're looking at the trauma complex, when we're looking at Neptune, Neptune directly represents the deep feelings of meaninglessness. So we all know that when we experience trauma, there is that feeling of meaninglessness, of disillusionment, disenchantment, and despair. Those feelings of what is this all for? Does it even matter? What is the point? And we suffer in that essential disconnect from source, disconnect from our own source, disconnect from our higher self, from our true self. And that's the Neptunian experience. Deep despair, deep disconnection from source energy, from divinity, essentially a meaninglessness that can go on. And so, some people can have this stronger than others. This is what essentially suicidal tendencies is all about, leading to that it becomes so meaningless, life itself. And this is a very Neptune experience. So Pluto identifies emotionally and psychologically with the mental impact of the event, Uranus, and with the emotional pain, Neptune. So Uranus is the vault that holds it all, along with his own mental context. So Pluto, what I mean here by Pluto, identifies emotionally and psychologically. So Pluto, as we know, is this deep psychological, emotional, essentially construct in this lifetime that our soul is working through to realize the ego structure, what the ego structure has created. And so Pluto is that deep identity, that deep emotional, psychological patterns. And Pluto connects to the mental impact, which is Uranus, and Pluto connects to the emotional pain, which is Neptune. And so we'll see Pluto is like the whole, right? That's why when we're doing evolutionary astrology, we look to Pluto and the north and south nodes of the moon, and we see in Pluto the everything. We see the whole thing, where the person is so deeply focused and trying to realize themselves from out of these patterns, essentially the ego structure, belief system patterns that are essentially overlaid upon the soul experience. And so Pluto is that that core identification on an emotional psychological level. And then we refer to Uranus to see a deeper context of this trauma. We refer to Neptune to see a deeper context of this trauma. We then refer to Chiron to see more specifically. Then we refer to Saturn to see even more specifically. So basically, you can see how this is a method of unraveling all the various parts of the trauma complex as a whole, that how it is presented as a whole in the birth chart. All right, so we'll go into a bit of an example. So again, here's Oprah Winfrey's chart. Going back to understanding the Pluto, we know that she came in with a core soul identification. Essentially, when I say a soul identification, this really doesn't have anything to do with the true infinite being of her soul that she is. This has to do with what her soul is coming in to realize about the ego structures that she has been essentially feeding her energy into, and how to evolve to a higher level, to a higher vibrational essence, her own ego, so that she can be in greater sort of communion and relationship with her true essential self, with her higher self, with her infinite being, with her true soul nature. So she came in with this powerful soul identification around power, being deeply powerful, the 8th house Scorpio, being in touch with great power. And also, she had the experience, 7th house, 8th house, of being in relationships with people who were abusing power, who were dominating over her in certain ways. So the right and wrong use of power, and how our experience of our own power and the power to others can either limit us tremendously or essentially empower us. And so we see that she was not treated in a way that where she could feel Leo Cancer emotionally confident and emotionally secure and safe in her environment with other people. So when we go on, and we know that her Pluto polarity point is 24 Aquarius in the second house. So her soul has this intention to Aquarius, second house, to second house, my deepest values, my core self, who I truly am on the most intimate inner level of self, to come back to that place of knowing, of orientation, to come out of the chaos of other people, the false emotional stories that she is less than, that she is unworthy, that she is deserving of this pain, and to come into Aquarius to gain an objective awareness, to take the big picture, to expand further beyond this world, this experience she had, and to go into greater, higher, objective perspective upon this. And and so she's born not only with the Pluto polarity point there, but 3 planets also emphasizing and assisting the journey for her. She's very Aquarian. She has that higher perspective. She has objectivity. She is willing to stand back and stand out and gain clarity about very, very personal and intimate situations with people. So when we look at Saturn, how consciousness is structured to assist the Pluto polarity point and resolve Chiron pain. So we look at her Saturn. All right, so I said that Saturn receives the pain body information from Chiron as Chiron picks it up from Uranus, which contains information from Neptune and Pluto in the Uranus library storehouse. So Chiron delivers this message to Saturn. And so we can see how her Saturn is in the 10th house and it's in Scorpio. So the deepest challenge, the wounding, the pain that we see that she is struggling with here, with herself here, does have to do with Scorpio 10th house. What is the 10th house? The abuse of power, dominance over other people. It's about provision, the father archetype, leadership. So she obviously was born into a situation where the parental figures, the father figures, the men, the authority, the external structure of support and security in her life, Scorpio, was abusive, created loss, betrayal, abandonment, and sexual abuse, which is what she experienced. So the Scorpio dynamic. So it was extremely traumatic and abusive for her. The higher path that we see here, what she has essentially self-mastery to accomplish here, with the Saturn representing a height of victory and a height of evolutionary awareness. The structure of her consciousness was designed in such a way, Scorpio 10th house, that she herself feels authority. She feels like an authority figure. The structure of her consciousness is in the 10th house. So she feels like a leader. She feels like she has a strong role in society, that she is here to represent, to have a reputation, to help lead people, to guide people. That's what the 10th house is. And she also, Scorpio, she has the capacity to go very deep, to peer very deep into what is really true, what is really real. She has depth. So we can see that the conundrum that Saturn represents always, Saturn is something that we're very deeply challenged with. We have fear with it. So someone with Saturn and Scorpio can be afraid of the dark, afraid of the depth, afraid of going in. So obviously we can see that with her, there still must be some significant fear to go into such great pain, right? It's painful. She experienced terrible abuse. And so that is a place where we could see is highly challenging for her to sort of return to that place and to go there. However, she did, and she does, and she held that space. That's the other thing, holding space, the 10th house, the container to be a provider, to provide for others in that very scorpionic way. Libra on the 10th house for so many people on her talk show. She held space for Scorpio, for the deep truth, for the hard stuff to look at. So we can see how Saturn is working in this way as assisting her Pluto polarity point, her soul evolution, her highest intention to realize her true self, her true divinity is here in this symbol. So when we go to Chiron, carrying the etheric signature from the past into this life as the deep wound imprint, here to be healed, like cures like. So that the whole idea of the homeopathic knowledge, like cures like, to go a little bit into the disease, into the trauma, into the wound, is where the cure is at. So it essentially, homeopathy represents healing on its purest level, as far as the understanding around that we have to embrace what is. We have to actually go in and clearly understand what is in order to cure what is. So like cures like this. So like cures like, meaning that her Chiron is in Capricorn. Again, that wound around external authority, around support systems, around potentially masculine, the father figure. There could be the father wound here with all this 10th house Capricorn, Chiron. That the wound of the provider, the provision that she essentially did not receive as a young person in this world as a child. So carrying that signature of that wound and trauma, and that is essentially what she's needing to heal, to feel a sense of support and structure in the world, which of course we know she created. And that's also the thing about Saturn, Capricorn 10th house, is that it is entirely about our own self motivation, our own ability to self lead. So she came in with a very strong power around that very sort of mode of operation, that how people lead themselves in the abuse of power and control over others is so devastating. That is the wound in her, and she chose to lead herself and out of that, out of those patterns, out of that trauma, and into a very high expression of these archetypes. So when we go over to Uranus, library of unconscious memory, storehouse of mental, emotional, physical, psychological, and spiritual trauma imprints as received from the Pluto, Neptune signatures. So we can see here that just having Uranus on the south node, that trauma signature, the trauma complex, is already activated. She's coming from trauma. She's born into trauma. It's on an emotional, very intimate, very personal level. It's deeply connected to the family structure, Cancer. And Uranus is retrograde, which also implies a very internalized self-awareness around this nature. So the trauma is here. And when we look to see what is the most unique essence of her true self that she is here to liberate from out of this, from out of the sort of the bonds or the control that the trauma has, because trauma does essentially have control in the same way that the ego can control a person. This false ideas, these false truths, the belief in our suffering. And not to say that it isn't real in a certain way, of course it is, but then there is the return to where we know that we can overcome, that we are more than the negative ideas of self that have been impressed or laid upon us. So her Uranus, that liberation into her true self, is her nature of Cancer, that she is a healer, that she is a nurturer, that she cares, that she's emotionally intelligent, that she's emotionally present. And so we can see that she was exercising that, she was being in that, she was developing that even more. So with the Neptune, spiritual, emotional, highly emotive, trauma, meaninglessness. So Neptune is an emotional, it's rules Pisces in the 12th house, it's water. So there is this highly emotive, emotional quality to Neptune. And that meaninglessness, the feeling that disillusionment energy, it's deeply emotional when people are feeling those things, despair. And so we can see that the meaninglessness, the disillusionment, the disenchantment about the world. She was born into a world that was not wonderful. And so I imagine there was quite a bit of despair and disillusionment and meaninglessness that she was experienced directly in her world environment, the environment around her, the adults around her, the system around her. There was probably a lot of religious conditioning as well, because it was South Mississippi at that time. Also the misogyny, a dominance over women and women of color, that is something that was very deep. Going on and still does. So definitely she was experiencing that. So the disillusionment around that, her environment, in relationship with other people, the discord, Libra is going to represent some kind of dysfunctional, extreme imbalances in relationships, intellectual perspective, point of view, discord. It's just like in conflict. And her where Neptune, that higher expression of Neptune representing where she can connect to her divinity and her source energy, is through, once again, her own self-leadership and her what she was capable of doing for this world, the provider essence that she really tapped into, and to be a leader and to be someone who had a huge effect on the collective itself and on this world, um, and through relationships. So I don't know too much about her on that more personal level, but that she would find that spiritual connection, that higher meaning, that higher union with her true self and source through partnership. And so she must have, I would assume, had a lot of moments like that, even, on her talk show, where she was able to connect with people on a very deep level and reach something very personal in her own soul. And then again, deep psychological identification on a soul level is Pluto. So that takes us back to the Pluto. So I know this is quite complex, and but I do hope that you were able to grasp. It might be something to go over a couple times with the video. And like I said, we'll be going over this quite a bit in the chart interpretation classes. And yeah, when you can begin to sort of use your own chart or your family and friends' charts to sort of follow this model of unraveling and deepening into the core trauma energy archetypes that the person is dealing with. It's just so fascinating, and there's a lot of information to gain from it, to be able to help people and to be able to understand much more deeper. So again, please leave me any questions that you have. I would love to continue the conversation on this topic with you. You can post any personal charts, your own chart or anyone else's that you want with any questions you have, and we can keep exploring more into this topic. I'll see you soon. Take care.